Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the self-titled album from Dream Theater. Now if you know progressive metal at all, or even if you don't, you probably know about Dream Theater. It was one of the flagship bands of the genre to come out in the late 80s to adopt progressive elements into metal, and it was one of the few to do it as successfully as they did. Along with Queensryche, Fates Warning, and Tool, Dream Theater was one of the few progressive metal acts that actually managed to achieve some measure of critical acclaim and commercial success, albeit most prominently in the 90s. They were a band with a reputation for incredibly long songs, instrumental excellence, and several fantastic albums throughout their career that are just required listening for the progressive metal genre. That's actually one of the reasons, on that note, why this review is kind of a month late. When hearing that the band was releasing a new album this year, I took the opportunity to re-listen through the band's entire discography, starting with the very beginning, and combining that with my regular hectic review schedule, it took until now to finally talk about this band. And really, Dream Theater has such a storied history of excellence that I'm actually a little lost at where to even take this review other than to establish my general feelings regarding the band. They're great, but I would never quite say that they're my favorite. While production in Dream Theater's early days was always inconsistent at points, they managed to iron out most of these issues almost a decade ago, and for the most part the instrumentation is incredibly complex and interesting across the board. Initially, I was skeptical about how well the new drummer Mike Mangini would fit in with the rest of the band, but he turned around surprisingly well. I still don't think that James LaBrie's voice is great in a more hardcore vein. He just doesn't really come across as intimidating or forceful enough to justify some of those songs, but he's incredibly melodic and powerful where he needs to be in that particular vein, and he's still a very compelling and emotive singer. I guess if I was going to nail down my consistent issue with Dream Theater, it'd be that I don't always find them to be good technical songwriters. Oh sure, they've written incredible songs with deep themes and beautiful symbolism that can really resonate with you, but there are just these occasional moments of lyrical clumsiness that they kind of irk me at points. But really, I'm nitpicking here, and Dream Theater has long ago reached the stage of being one of the elder statesmen of the prog metal genre, and I can't fault them for that. And besides, they almost pretty much get a free pass for Images and Words, Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from Memory, and The 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. Those are probably my three favorite albums from them. With all that being said, however, I did take a certain amount of pause at Dream Theater releasing a self-titled album for their 12th. Look, it's just a pet peeve of mine, I know that, but it did forewarn me that Dream Theater weren't exactly going back to their concept album days, and I think that was a little disappointing. But the positive critical buzz the album has received over the past few weeks did reassure me that the album was better than the last one, and I went in with some high hopes. So, with all that in mind, did Dream Theater's Dream Theater actually turn out pretty well? Thankfully, it did. And while I wouldn't quite consider this album as incredibly strong as my personal top 3, it's still a very, very worthy addition to the Dream Theater canon, and it's far from their worst. Besides, when you're dealing with a band who has made iconic albums, not just for the band, but for the genre itself, even saying that it's not quite at their best is still a high standard indeed, and still some element of praise in that. For me, this self-titled album would slot itself comfortably into the upper echelons of the mid-range of Dream Theater's output. Definitely great, definitely something that I'm going to revisit throughout this year, but not exactly anything that will redefine the genre or be notably iconic. And you know what? Sometimes you don't need that. Sometimes it's enough. So let's talk about the instrumentation and production. For the most part, it's absolutely top of the line. Do I even need to say much here about the instrumental prowess of this band at this point? Particularly considering every member gets distinctive and memorable solos at multiple tempos that each provide their own degrees of insight and nuance to the tracks. John Petrucci is incredible on guitar. John Myung has potent presence on bass. And Jordan Rudess, shit. You know what? If I was going to highlight somebody for instrumental excellence on this record, it would probably be Rudess, because with the wide variety of perfectly integrated synth sections and jaw-dropping keyboard solos, I was consistently wowed here. But if I'm going to nitpick at all at anything instrumentally, it's a small thing with Mike Mangini. Oh, look, don't get me wrong, he's a great drummer. While his drumming is different than Portnoy's in my opinion, I prefer Portnoy's drumming. I think it's a better fit for Dream Theater, but Mike Mangini's doing his own thing, and he does enough here to prove his worth. But there's something about the way that he strikes his snare drums at a few points that just feels a little out of place with the rest of the mix. Now, I'll admit I don't have a great ear to pinpoint the exact cause of it. Maybe it's because he's using brushes or a specific type of drumstick, or maybe it's an element of the production, but it just doesn't feel entirely cohesive with the rest of the mix, and it caught my ear every time it happened. But still, that's an incredibly minor thing, and overall, Dream Theater still performs brilliantly as a seamless unit. Now, what becomes really interesting on this album is that Dream Theater really brings something of a different sound to this album, a much more diverse collection of sounds in comparison with some of the heavier and yet more homogeneous work that they did in the 2000s. The album is distinctly not as heavy, which I'd argue is a better fit for the band as a whole, as it better suits James LaPrie's voice. And with that in mind, there are a few moments where the Rush influence is unmistakable, particularly with I wouldn't call it a lifted riff from Limelight, but there's a similar tone to one of the songs. And Dream Theater adds their own unique brand of complexity to the riffs to elevate the songs above just being a ripoff or just being a copy. It definitely helps matters that Dream Theater's sound and production has taken a very distinctively symphonic bent on this album, which for the band proves to be a great fit, particularly on the awe-inspiring epic 22-minute song Illumination Theory, which for me was one of the big highlights of this album. What I really found engaging about this album as a whole is that despite the band's occasional tendency to leap into insane time signature shifting complexity and blazingly fast shredding, they also slow things down enough and prove to be very, very effective at the quieter moments. I've always had the belief that Dream Theater write incredibly beautiful and evocative ballads, and while there isn't really a pure acoustic ballad on this album, the slower moments here are definitely welcome. So with that, we need to come to the songwriting and themes, arguably the area where I think this album, well, it's the weakest part of this album. Now, I stand by the fact that Dream Theater aren't the best technical songwriters. They've got a good grasp of simplistic poetry. It's a simple style that can work for them, and sometimes simple songs can be the most effective and emotionally evocative. And indeed, songs like The Looking Glass, Along for the Ride, and Illumination Theory, they work incredibly well in this vein, taking simple, broad concepts and driving them home with a lot of clear focus, and the occasional bits of nuance to augment the overall picture. But if I'm going to have an issue here, it's this. Since the majority of the lyrics are now being written by Petrucci, the songs feel very arch and a little broad without the tighter and occasionally more intimate focus that made some of their earlier material, particularly those songs written by Portnoy that address some of his alcoholism, well, those songs really resonated because they had that intimate focus. They felt that they had that distinctive human element. Some of the songs on this album, they just don't deliver in the same way. Now, don't get me wrong, it fits. That broader style fits this style of music and the grander symphonic presentation. It fits it quite well. Hell, I'd argue that symphonic metal is one of the few genres that can get away with lyrics as broad as these in this particular vein. But I do feel that a certain element of focus is lost on the album as a whole. And given the variety of musical styles and the breadth of topics that they bring to the table, the album feels a little unfocused and lacking that true punch to end things. I guess you can make the argument that Illumination Theory serves as that particular climax point, but I don't know. For me, Illumination Theory works so much better as its own unique piece instead of as a culmination point for the rest of the album. Without that culmination point, the album just feels... it just doesn't fully climax for me. But regardless, what do I think about the self-titled album from Dream Theater as a whole? Well, I really like it. Its complexity, its breathtaking displays of talent from every single performer, its real emotional heart that can produce some incredibly moving moments coming out of nowhere. But I feel there's a lack of crystallizing focus and that lack of that central moment to really bring it all together. Instead, we get a collection of extremely strong songs and a ton of great music, but not quite that spot to make it truly transcendent. For me, with all that in mind, it's a very strong 8 out of 10 and a very good recommendation. Look, if you're a Dream Theater fan, especially if you like their lighter material, you're gonna like this album. If you like their heavier material, you're gonna get a few tracks that you'll find tolerable, but it probably won't satisfy you in quite the same vein. Just a little bit of a reminder here. Either way, the Dream Theater by Dream Theater, it's a great prog album, and it's a sign that almost 25 years into their career, Dream Theater still have that something special, and the album is definitely worth your time. check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching, even for a review that's a month late. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming up that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. I've got a couple days coming up and right now where there isn't much coming out until the 28th, where Arion's Theory of Everything comes out, and that's one of the albums I've been looking forward to all year. So I might take this some time to cover a few retrospectives. So until then, I'll see you next time.